Martin Hengel, Crucifixion, Chapter 1. The Folly of the Crucified Son of God. In 1 Corinthians 1:18, Paul says that in the eyes of those who are perishing, the word of the cross is folly. He goes on to emphasize the point further in verse 23 by saying that the crucified Christ is a stumbling block for the Jews and folly for the Gentiles. The Greek word moria, which he uses here, does not denote either a purely intellectual defect nor lack of transcendental wisdom. Something more is involved. Justin puts us on the right track when he describes the offense caused by the Christian's message to the ancient world as madness, mania, and sees the basis for this objection in Christian belief in the divine status of the crucified Jesus and his significance for salvation. Quote, "They say that our madness consists in the fact that we put a crucified man in second place after the unchangeable and eternal God, the creator of the world." Apology 1:13-4. Justin later concedes that demons have caused stories to be told about miraculous powers of the sons of Zeus and of their ascensions to heaven. Quote, "But in no case is there any imitation of the crucifixion." 55:1. It is the crucifixion that distinguishes the new message from the mythologies of all other peoples. The folly and madness of the crucifixion can be illustrated from the earliest pagan judgment on Christians. The younger Pliny, who calls the new sect a form of amentia in his Epistulae 10:96, 4-8, had heard from apostate Christians that Christians sang hymns to their Lord as to a god, quasi-deo, and went on to examine 2 slave girls under torture. Of course, the result was disappointing. I discovered nothing but a perverse and extravagant superstition. It must have been particularly offensive for a Roman governor that the one who was honored as a god had been nailed to the cross by the Roman authorities as a state criminal. His friend Tacitus speaks no less harshly of a pernicious superstition, and knows of the shameful fate of the founder. Quote, "Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius, at the hands of the procurator, Pontius Pilate." Unquote. The evil, malum, which he instigated, spread all too quickly to Rome, quote, "where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world meet and become popular," unquote, from Annals 15:44-3. Tacitus's precise knowledge of Christians and his contempt for them are probably to be derived from the trials of Christians which he carried out when he was governor in the province of Asia. In his dialogue Octavius, Minucius Felix begins by putting on the lips of his pagan interlocutor Caecilius a pointed piece of anti-Christian polemic, part of which goes back to a work by the famous orator Cornelius Fronto, who lived at the time of Marcus Aurelius. According to Caecilius, Christians put forward sick delusions, figmenta male sanae opiniones, 11:9, a senseless and crazy superstition, vana et demens superstitio, 9:2, which leads to an old womanly superstition, animalis superstitio, or to the destruction of all true religion, omnis religio destruatur, 13:5. Not least among the monstrosities of their faith is the fact that they worship one who has been crucified. Quote, "To say that their ceremonies center on a man put to death for his crime and on the fatal wood of the cross is to assign to these abandoned wretches sanctuaries which are appropriate to them, and the kind of worship they deserve." 9:4. The Christian Octavius does not find it easy to shake off this last charge. His answer makes it clear that the death of Jesus on the cross was inevitably folly and scandal even for the early Christians. Their pagan opponents quite unjustly assert that Christians worship a criminal and his cross, hominem noxium et crucem eius, 29:2. No criminal, indeed no earthly being whatsoever, deserves to be regarded as a god. On the other hand, Octavius does not go any further into the person of Jesus and his fate. Instead, he deals at some length with the charge of worshipping the cross. Quote, "Moreover, we do not reverence the cross, nor do we worship it. But you, who hold your wooden gods, ligneos deos, to be holy, also worship wooden crosses as parts of your divine images. For what are the military emblems, the banners and standards in your camps, if not gilded and decorated crosses? Not only is the form of your signs of victory like the structure of the cross, it even recalls a man fastened to it." 29:6 and following. Indeed, are they not aware that such a wooden god might perhaps have been part of a funeral pile or a gallows tree, that is a cross, rogi vel infelicis stipitis portio, 24:6. Octavius cannot deny the shamefulness of the cross, and therefore he is deliberately silent about the death of Jesus. He seeks to ward off any attack by going over to the counterattack, making use of the argument that divine effigies are contemptible, an argument which was already well tried in Jewish apologetic. You are the ones who worship crosses and divine effigies, which in some circumstances have a shameful origin. He avoids the real problem, namely that the Son of God died a criminal's death on the tree of shame. This was not appropriate for a form of argument which was concerned to prove that the one God of the Christians was identical with the God of the philosophers. Octavius's evasion to the point indicates the dilemma which all too easily led educated Christians into Docetism. Augustine has preserved for us an oracle of Apollo recorded by Porphyry, given an answer to a man's question what he can do to dissuade his wife from Christian belief. The god holds out little hope. Quote, "Let her continue as she pleases, persisting in her vain delusions, and lamenting in song a God who died in delusions, who was condemned by judges whose verdict was just, and executed in the prime of life by the worst of deaths, a death bound with iron." Civitatis Dei, 1923, page 690. This oracle, originally in Greek, admirably confirms the verdicts of Pliny, Tacitus, and Caecilius. The one whom Christians claim as their God is a dead God, a contradiction in itself. And if that were not enough, he had been condemned justly, as a criminal, by his judges, in the prime of life, that is, before his time, to the worst form of death. He had to endure being fastened to the cross with iron nails. All this evidence shows us the constantly varying forms of abhorrence at the new religious teaching. In comparison with the religious ideals of the ancient world, the Christian message had inevitably to be described in Suetonius's words as a new and pernicious superstition, superstitio nova et malefica, Nero 16:3. These accounts, with their marked contemptuous characterizations, are no coincidence. The heart of the Christian message, which Paul described as the word of the cross, logos tou stauru, ran counter not only to Roman political thinking, but to the whole ethos of religion in ancient times, and in particular to the ideas of God held by educated people. True, the Hellenistic world was familiar with the death and apotheosis of some predominantly barbarian demigods and heroes of primeval times. Attis and Adonis were killed by a wild boar, Osiris was torn to pieces by Typhon Seth, and Dionysus Zagreus by the Titans. Heracles alone of the Greeks voluntarily immolated himself on Mount Oeta. However, not only did all this take place in the darkest, most distant past, but it was narrated in questionable myths, which had to be interpreted either euhemeristically or at least allegorically. By contrast, to believe that the one pre-existent Son of the one true God, the mediator at creation and the Redeemer of the world, had appeared in very recent times in out-of-the-way Galilee, as a member of the obscure people of the Jews, and even worse had died the death of a common criminal on the cross, could only be regarded as a sign of madness. The real gods of Greece and Rome could be distinguished from mortal men, but the very fact that they were immortal, they had absolutely nothing in common with the cross as a sign of shame. Aiskune, Hebrews 12:2, the infamous stake, infamus stipes, the barren, infelix lignum, or criminal wood, panurgikon zulon, the terrible cross, maxima mala crux of the slaves of Plautus, and thus of the one who, in the words of Celsus, was bound in the most ignominious fashion and executed in a shameful way. Celsus puts these phrases in the mouths of Christians as a parody of the faith which they require. They are very similar to the carefully calculated exuberance in Cicero's documentary speech against Verus, it was never delivered, in which the orator makes the charge that the former governor of Sicily inflicted the crudelissimum taeterimumque supplicium on a Roman citizen, with the utmost haste and without further investigation, having it carried out immediately. Some further Greek and Latin evidence may serve to show that this statement by the great statesman and legal advocate, like other similar ones, was something more than an isolated aesthetic judgment, as has been suggested recently, remote from the views of ordinary people and the rest of the ancient world. For example, Josephus, who was as Jewish advisor to Titus during the siege of Jerusalem, witness to quite enough object lessons of this kind, describes crucifixion tersely and precisely as the most wretched of deaths, thanaton ton oiktiston. In this context, he reports that a threat by the Roman besiegers to crucify a Jewish prisoner caused the garrison of Machaerus to surrender in exchange for safe conduct. According to Lucian, the letter T was given its evil significance by the evil instrument shaped in the form of a tau, which tyrants erected to hang men on. I think we can only punish Tau by making a T of him. In the treatise on dreams by Artemidorus, to dream that one is flying among the birds can only be of ill omen for criminals, for it brings the death penalty to criminals, and very often through crucifixion. Similarly, in his didactic astrological poem, Pseudo-Manetho enumerates the criminals who must justifiably expect crucifixion, and includes among them murderers, robbers, mischief makers, impedolobas, and deceivers. Quote, punished with limbs outstretched, they see the stake as their fate. They are fastened and nailed to it in the most bitter torment, evil food for birds of prey, and grim pickings for dogs. Unquote. This evidence from the 3rd century AD shows how widespread was the death penalty, and the use of crucifixion even in the later empire. Nor had there been any change in the negative attitudes towards crucifixion. From the time of Plautus, that is, from the 3rd century BC onwards, there is evidence of the use of crooks as a vulgar taunt among the lower classes. It can be found on the lips of slaves and prostitutes, and is comparable with furcifur, cruciarius, and even patibulatus. An English equivalent might be gallows bird or hangdog. The abusive e in mala maximum crucem thus meant something like be hanged. Varro, Cicero's contemporary, uses the offensive word crux as a vivid illustration for his etymological theory. Lene est auribus cum dicimus voluptas, asperum cum dicimus crux. Ipsius verbi asperitas cum dolores quem crux efficit asperitate concordet. To say pleasure is gentle in the ears, but to say cross is harsh. The harshness of the latter word matches the pain brought on by the cross. The learned man presupposes that everyone will accept this argument. We may no doubt assume that this horrible word did not sound any better in the ears of a slave or foreigner, peregrinus, than it did to a member of the Roman nobility. Even Paul's Greek audience could hardly have approved of the logos tou staurou, much less the Jews who could see the Roman crosses erected in Palestine, especially when they could hardly forget the saying about the curse laid upon anyone hanged on a tree, Deuteronomy 21:23. A crucified Messiah, Son of God or God, must have seemed a contradiction in terms to anyone, Jew, Greek, Roman, or barbarian, asked to believe such a claim, and it will certainly have been thought offensive and foolish.